The dry wind howls through the open plains as the sun sets, casting long shadows across a dusty saloon near the Texas-Mexico border. The door creaks open, and a group of rough, tattooed men stroll in with the arrogance of those who think they own the land. Their eyes scan the room, seeking a quiet rancher hunched over in the corner. Little do they know, the man they're about to confront is not the simple farmer they expect. He's a living legend, a former marshal known only as the Silent One. His name is Samuel Carter, but around these parts everyone knows him as the Silent One. Once a feared lawman, Samuel now seeks peace on his small ranch far from the violence he left behind. He's a man of few words, preferring to live a quiet life and avoid the conflicts that once consumed him. But deep inside, the fire of justice still burns, waiting for the right moment to reignite. Samuel's only goal now is to protect his land, the one place that offers him solace after years of bloodshed. He wants to live in peace, to stay away from the violence of his past. But sometimes, peace can only be earned through battle. When a ruthless Colombian cartel led by Emiliano Vargas rolls into town, they assume Samuel is just another weak rancher who can be intimidated. They want to take control of the region, using fear and violence as their tools, but they haven't reckoned with Samuel, a man who knows exactly what it takes to fight back when the stakes are high. This is a story of justice, vengeance, and an epic showdown between a man who seeks peace and a cartel that threatens his way of life. Stick around for the ride. Subscribe now to witness the action unfold in a way you won't forget. Samuel had grown accustomed to the quiet life, the sun rising over the horizon, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the smell of fresh hay and dirt. It was the peace he had longed for after years of chasing down criminals, always on the run. His ranch, nestled just outside a small town near the border, had become his sanctuary. The days were long, but they were his own, and he relished the simplicity of working the land, tending to the animals, and living life on his terms. No one bothered him here, but peace, it seemed, was never meant to last. The arrival of the Colombian cartel in town was a threat he could no longer ignore. It began with Emiliano Vargas, a ruthless man with eyes as cold as the steel of his guns. His cartel was known for one thing: domination. They'd taken control of every region they set foot in, leaving fear and blood in their wake. And now, they had their sights set on this small corner of the world. Vargas and his men rolled into town one afternoon, their cars kicking up dust as they made their way through the streets. The locals watched in fear, knowing all too well the kind of men who had just arrived. They set up shop in the saloon, marking their territory with the arrogant swagger of those who believed they were untouchable. The town trembled under the weight of their presence. The cartel's enforcers began terrorizing the people, demanding protection money from the shopkeepers and intimidating anyone who dared resist. They had no use for subtlety, only power. Samuel watched from his ranch, his gaze fixed on the town in the distance. He knew what was happening, but he chose not to get involved, at least not yet. This wasn't his fight. Not unless it came to his doorstep, but he could feel the shift in the air, the tension, the fear, and somewhere deep inside he knew that soon he would have to make a choice. Would he stay silent, continuing to live his life in peace, or would he take up arms once more, risking everything to protect the people who had once called him a hero? It wasn't long before Samuel was forced to witness the cartel's cruelty firsthand. The town, once vibrant and full of life, had now become a place where fear reigned supreme. The men under Vargas's command were ruthless, and their violence knew no bounds. Samuel, from the comfort of his ranch, heard the sounds of screams carried by the wind. The cries of a young farmer, Diego, echoed through the streets, and Samuel's heart tightened. He knew the boy, just a few years younger than he had been when he first arrived in these parts. Diego had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was barely more than a child, struggling to make ends meet, when the cartel's enforcers decided to make an example of him. The men had beaten Diego senseless, their laughter cutting through the air like a knife. It was a scene that had played out too many times before in towns like this, and Samuel couldn't ignore it any longer. But Samuel wasn't the man he once was. The anger that once burned in him had dimmed with time, replaced by a quiet, almost stoic resolve. He didn't crave violence. He didn't want to kill, but he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man suffer either. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. With slow, measured steps, Samuel walked into the street. His mere presence was enough to make the cartel's enforcers pause. They didn't know who he was yet, but they could feel the weight of something dangerous in the air. Samuel didn't speak. He never had to. His reputation as a former lawman preceded him, and the silence he carried was often more powerful than words. Emiliano Vargas, still unaware of the man behind the mysterious figure, heard about the confrontation. He scoffed at the idea of a simple rancher standing up to him, a man who hadn't even drawn his gun. "He's nothing but a farmer," Vargas sneered to his men. "Let him play his little games. He'll fall in line soon enough." But even as he dismissed Samuel as a threat, there was a seed of doubt planted in his mind. No one walked with the kind of quiet confidence that Samuel did, unless they had a past, and a deadly one at that. Vargas didn't know it yet, but the man he was underestimating had already decided that his peaceful life was over. The Silent One was about to return, and this time, he wasn't going to back down. The next few days were a blur for Samuel. As the cartel tightened its grip on the town, the weight of his past began to press down on him like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The memories came flooding back unbidden, memories of a time when he had worn a badge, when justice had been his only purpose. Samuel had been a marshal once, a lawman known across the West for his speed, accuracy, and relentless pursuit of justice. He had been a man who lived by the gun, feared by outlaws and respected by the innocent. But it had come at a cost. The badge had been a shield, but it had also been a target. Samuel had seen things, atrocities, murders, and the kinds of violence that could twist a man's soul. He had dealt with men who thought they could outrun the law, and he had always brought them to justice. But in the end, the law couldn't save his family. One evening, after a long day of chasing down criminals, Samuel had returned home to find his wife and child dead, their lives taken in a senseless act of violence by a group of outlaws who had never been caught. The grief had shattered him. The loss had been too much. He couldn't bear the thought of continuing down the same bloody path that had led to their deaths. So, he hung up his guns and walked away from the law. He left the badge behind, swearing never to pick up a weapon again. But peace, it seemed, was never meant for him. The world around him had always been chaotic, and now with the cartel threatening his home and the people he had come to care for, he was faced with an impossible choice. Could he stay true to the man he had become, the one who wanted to live in peace, far from the violence of his past? Or would he return to the gunslinger he had been, the man who had been feared and revered in order to protect the innocent once more? It was a question he didn't have the answer to, but it was one he would have to face soon. The cartel had come to stay, and they weren't going to leave without a fight. Samuel knew that if he didn't act, more innocent people would suffer. It was time to make a choice, and as much as he hated it, the choice seemed clear. He wasn't just protecting his land anymore, he was protecting the town, and in doing so, he was going to have to face the blood-stained past he had tried so hard to forget. The Silent One was coming back, and this time he wasn't going to walk away. The sun had barely risen when Samuel heard the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding the earth. His heart sank as he looked up from the front porch of his ranch. A group of cartel men, led by Vargas's right-hand enforcer, had arrived at his gate. Their eyes were hard, filled with malice, and their weapons were drawn. This wasn't a friendly visit. Samuel knew exactly why they were here. Vargas had made his move. It was no longer about intimidating the townsfolk. Now he was coming for Samuel, trying to send a message that no one, not even the legendary Gunslinger, was untouchable. Without a word, the cartel's men charged towards Samuel's ranch, ready to make him an example of anyone who dared stand against them. The first to reach the gate was a brutish man with a scar running down his face. He raised his rifle, aiming straight at Samuel's chest. "Vargas wants you to understand one thing, rancher," the man sneered. "This is our land now. You're just another obstacle, and obstacles get crushed." Samuel didn't flinch. He stood tall, his calm presence unshaken. But as the cartel's men drew closer, they made their mistake. They underestimated the man who had once been a marshal. They assumed he was just another aging rancher, easy to break. The first shot rang out, but it wasn't Samuel's. The cartel enforcer's rifle exploded into the ground beside Samuel, a clean shot to the hand. The gun dropped, and the man cursed, stumbling back in shock. Samuel stood motionless, his hand resting on his old revolver. "Get off my land." Samuel's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen the world burn and was no longer afraid of the flames. His eyes were steely, and though he had not drawn his gun yet, It was clear that he would do so in an instant if provoked. The men hesitated, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. They had heard stories of Samuel's precision, his speed, stories that had become legends in towns far and wide. And yet, Vargas had ordered them to break him, to show the town that no one was beyond their reach. The enforcer, now trembling with anger, spat on the ground. "We'll see if you're as tough as they say," he growled, motioning for the others to advance. But before they could make a move, Samuel's hand shot out like lightning, drawing his revolver with a speed that belied his age. A single shot rang through the air, knocking the rifle out of another man's hands. The remaining cartel enforcers hesitated again, their arrogance faltering as they realized the man standing before them wasn't afraid to draw blood. "Go back to Vargas," Samuel said, his voice now hard and final. "Tell him I warned you. This ends when I say it ends." The cartel's men slowly backed away, realizing that this quiet rancher was not someone they could intimidate so easily. Samuel stood tall, his revolver still at his side, ready for whatever came next. The warning had been made, and it was clear. If Vargas wanted to play this game, Samuel was ready to take it to the next level. As the men retreated, Samuel's eyes followed them, a sense of foreboding settling in his chest. This was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and Samuel knew that soon he would have to face the full wrath of the cartel. But for now, he had made one thing clear: no one was going to take his land without a fight. The air around Samuel's ranch seemed to thicken after the encounter with the cartel. It wasn't just the heat of the sun, now high in the sky, or the oppressive silence that had fallen over the land. It was the feeling that something was brewing, something bigger than the quiet days he had come to cherish. The peace he had fought so hard to build was crumbling, and with every step he took, the storm seemed to draw closer. Samuel wasn't a man who rushed into battle. He had learned that in his years as a lawman. Patience, strategy, and careful preparation were his tools. He needed to be ready for what was coming, and he needed to make sure the people in town were ready too. The cartel wasn't just going to go away. They had a plan, and it involved more than intimidation. If Samuel was going to protect his home and the people he cared about, he had to make his next move count. He rode into town that evening, his worn boots crunching on the dusty road. As he passed through the streets, the people looked at him with a mix of admiration and fear. Some still remembered the legend of Samuel, the Silent One, but the others, those who had never seen him draw his gun or enforce the law, were more hesitant, unsure of where his loyalties truly lay. Samuel made his way to the blacksmith shop where his old friend Tomas worked. Tomas had been with him through many battles, a trusted ally who had always been there when Samuel needed him most. Together, they had faced down outlaws, corrupt officials, and more than a few hard times. Now Tomas was the only man Samuel trusted to help him prepare for the fight ahead. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Samuel asked as he stepped into the shop, the sound of hammer striking iron ringing in the background. "I do," Tomas replied, setting down his hammer. His face was grim, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've made a powerful enemy, Samuel, but you're not the same man you once were. We've all heard the stories, but you've been living in peace for too long." "I'm still the same man I was, Tomas," Samuel said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of years. "I've just forgotten how to fight for a while, but that's about to change." Tomas nodded, understanding. "Then we'll get you ready. I'll sharpen your weapons, make sure everything's in working order." The two men worked late into the night, preparing for the battle that would soon be upon them. They knew that this wouldn't be like any fight they had faced before. The cartel was a formidable foe with resources and men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But Samuel had something they didn't: experience, a sharp mind, and a reputation that could still strike fear into the hearts of men. As the night wore on, Samuel stood outside Tomas's shop, looking out over the town. In the distance, he could see the lights of the saloon flickering in the darkness. The town was divided. Some of the townsfolk had already pledged their support to the cartel, too scared to resist. Others, like Tomas, would stand with him. But the rest? They were undecided. They were waiting to see which side would prevail. Samuel knew what he had to do. He had already issued a warning, but it hadn't been enough. Vargas and his men needed to understand that this was more than just a rancher's land they were threatening. It was a town's future, and Samuel wasn't going to let them destroy it without a fight. He rode back to his ranch, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the final confrontation was near. The lines had been drawn, and there would be no turning back. Samuel had given his warning, but the question now was whether the cartel would heed it or push him into the war he had worked so hard to avoid. The tension in the air was palpable. War was on the horizon, and Samuel was ready to face it, not as the marshal he once was, but as a man who had everything to lose. The time for peace was over. The day Samuel had been dreading finally arrived. Word spread through the town like wildfire. The cartel had planned an ambush at the local saloon. It was their way of drawing him out, a test of his courage, a move to see if he was truly willing to fight for the people he claimed to protect. Samuel had no illusions about the stakes. This was no longer just about him or his ranch. The whole town was on the line, and the cartel was making sure everyone knew it. He rode into town alone, his old revolver resting in the holster at his side. The streets were eerily quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Samuel could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him as he passed, some with hope, others with fear. They were waiting to see what he would do, and Samuel knew he couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. As he neared the saloon, the door creaked open, and a dozen men from the cartel stepped into view. Their eyes were cold, their hands ready to draw. Samuel didn't flinch. His stance was steady, his gaze unyielding. They had underestimated him before, and now they would learn the hard way. The cartel's plan was simple. They would bait him into a confrontation, then overwhelm him with numbers. But what they hadn't accounted for was the fact that Samuel wasn't just a man of action, he was a man of strategy. He knew the town, knew the layout of the streets, and knew exactly how to turn the tables. The first man lunged at him, drawing a knife with a snarl. Samuel moved faster than anyone expected. With a swift motion, he grabbed the man's arm, twisting it until the knife dropped to the ground. A quick punch to the face sent the man staggering back, but Samuel didn't pause. His eyes flicked to the others who were already reaching for their guns. "Stay back," Samuel said in a low voice, his tone carrying an authority that cut through the tension like a knife. "I don't want to hurt anyone." But the cartel wasn't interested in negotiations. The next few seconds blurred in a flash of gunfire and movement. Samuel was a blur of precision, his revolver moving with deadly accuracy. He took out the first man who drew his gun, then turned to disarm the second before he could fire. He didn't shoot to kill, just to incapacitate. His shots were clean, his aim true. It was a dance, one he had perfected over the years. The men around him were faltering now. They had expected a simple ambush, but instead they had encountered the silent gunslinger, the man whose reputation had preceded him long before he ever walked into this town. One by one, they backed off, their confidence shaken. Samuel didn't stop moving, his focus unbroken, his eyes scanning the room for the next threat. As the last of the cartel men fled, Samuel's hand hovered over his holstered revolver, ready for another shot if needed. The saloon was quiet again, the sounds of chaos fading into the background. Samuel didn't take a victory stance. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, the weight of his actions settling over him. In the silence that followed, a few of the townspeople emerged from the shadows, eyes wide with awe and fear. Samuel turned to them, his expression unreadable. "Tell Vargas," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't over, not by a long shot." The men who had been with the cartel were gone, but Samuel knew that this was just a small skirmish in a larger war. Vargas would be furious. The message had been sent, but it had also been received. Samuel was still a force to be reckoned with, and the battle for the future of this town was just beginning. As Samuel left the saloon, his mind was already racing, thinking of what would come next. The town would talk about this ambush for days, maybe weeks, but Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before the cartel would come back for round two, and this time they wouldn't be so easily deterred. It didn't take long for the news of Samuel's victory at the saloon to spread throughout the region. Whispers of his skill and precision traveled quickly, growing with every retelling. What was once the story of a retired lawman now became the legend of the Silent One, a man who had not only survived an ambush, but had decimated the cartel's men with the cold efficiency of a seasoned gunslinger. But this wasn't the end of Samuel's troubles. If anything, it was just the beginning. Vargas was furious. His pride had been wounded, and in the world he inhabited, that was something that couldn't be allowed to stand. Within hours, Samuel became the target of a bounty, dead or alive. It was a brutal move, a clear sign that the cartel had decided to end Samuel's interference once and for all. A reward had been placed on his head, and men from all over the region began arriving to collect. They came in droves, bounty hunters, mercenaries, and every kind of man who lived by the gun. Some were hardened veterans, scarred by countless battles. Others were young, eager, and desperate for the reward money. They all had one thing in common: they were out for blood, and that blood was Samuel's. It didn't take long for the first wave of bounty hunters to find him. Samuel had anticipated this. He had lived through too many manhunts of his own, had seen too many lives lost over greed and revenge, not to recognize the signs. He was no longer hiding. He wasn't running. He rode into town early one morning, the sun barely cresting the horizon, casting long shadows on the empty streets. He was calm, collected, and ready. As he passed through the town square, a group of men stepped from the shadows, guns drawn. The leader, a grizzled man with a scar over one eye, sneered at Samuel. "You've got a price on your head, old man," the leader said, his voice rough and threatening. "And we're here to collect. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his revolver, and his eyes never left the leader's. The other bounty hunters shifted nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Samuel's reputation, his stillness, had already begun to work its magic. They weren't just facing a rancher. They were facing a man who had killed with a single shot before they even knew they were in danger. One of the younger hunters, eager to prove himself, moved first. His hand flew to his sidearm, but before he could draw, Samuel's revolver was already in his hand. A sharp crack split the air, and the young man's weapon flew from his grasp, landing in the dirt. Samuel's eyes never left him. "I don't want to kill you," Samuel said, his voice low and steady, "but I'll defend myself." The leader hesitated, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. Samuel had already disarmed one of his men with barely a move. It was clear that this wouldn't be an easy fight, and the cost of failure was high. The remaining bounty hunters, seeing their comrade disarmed so quickly, began to reconsider. They had been sent to kill, yes, but they weren't fools. Not all of them. The leader, after a tense moment, raised his hands slowly. "We'll leave for now," he growled, "but you're a dead man, Samuel. Don't think this is over." With that, the group retreated, leaving Samuel standing alone in the center of town. The message had been sent. As they vanished into the horizon, Samuel stood there, his hand still gripping the revolver, his mind already calculating the next move. He knew the bounty hunters would return. He knew they would come in greater numbers, more determined than ever. But Samuel had lived this life once before, and he had no intention of losing now. The war had only just begun, and with it the real challenge for Samuel Carter, the silent one, was about to unfold. The tension in the town had reached a boiling point. Every man, woman, and child could feel it. The cartel, now emboldened by the bounty on Samuel's head, had become more brazen, more open in their efforts to assert control. The streets were no longer safe. Every corner seemed to hold the shadow of violence. The air was thick with fear, and no one could predict how much longer it would be before things went from bad to worse. But Samuel had made up his mind. He had given his warnings, and now the time for words had passed. The stakes had risen too high for him to stay silent any longer. The cartel's actions had pushed him to the brink, and if they thought they could continue unchecked, they were gravely mistaken. It was in the dead of night when word came that the cartel had kidnapped Diego, the young farmer who had once been the victim of their first attack. They had taken him as leverage, hoping to force Samuel into submission. It was a cruel tactic, one designed to break him, to show him that no one was beyond their reach. Samuel's heart sank when he heard the news. Diego had been under his protection, and now the cartel had used him as a pawn in their sick game. This was more than just a personal affront. This was a challenge, a direct threat to everything Samuel stood for. The time for hiding, for waiting, was over. Without hesitation, Samuel mounted his horse, his old revolver now resting firmly in his holster. He rode into town, his silhouette a dark shape against the pale moonlight. The streets were empty, the town eerily still. It seemed like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between Samuel and the cartel. He stopped at the edge of the town, overlooking the saloon where the cartel had set up their base of operations. He knew that Diego would be there, likely tied up and guarded. Samuel had made up his mind. If the cartel wanted to play this game, he would play it on his terms. They had crossed the line, and now there would be no turning back. Samuel dismounted and walked toward the saloon, his boots echoing in the quiet night. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk watching him from their windows. They were waiting for something to happen, for him to act, for him to show them the man they had heard stories about. As he approached the saloon, the door creaked open. The men guarding the entrance sneered at him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken Samuel, but they hadn't accounted for his resolve. "You've gone too far," Samuel said, his voice cold and steady. "You've hurt people who were never meant to be a part of this fight. Now you're going to pay for it." One of the guards laughed, drawing his pistol. "You think you can stop us, old man?" he taunted. "Vargas is in there. You're just one man." Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. His hand moved like lightning, drawing his revolver from its holster. A single shot rang out, knocking the guard's pistol to the ground before he even had a chance to pull the trigger. The other guards froze, eyes wide with disbelief. Samuel wasn't just a man. He was a force to be reckoned with. "Tell Vargas," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the tension, "that if he doesn't release Diego by sunrise, I'll come for him next." The guards didn't move, didn't dare to challenge him. Samuel didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the silence. The warning had been made. It was now up to Vargas whether he would heed it or face the consequences. As Samuel rode back to his ranch, the weight of what was to come hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just a fight for the land anymore. It was a fight for the soul of the town. A battle between justice and corruption, between a man who had long since put away his guns and a cartel that had underestimated him at every turn. The final showdown was on the horizon, and it was only a matter of time before Samuel would have to face Vargas, and everything he had spent so many years trying to avoid. The following day, the air was thick with anticipation. The sun barely kissed the sky, but Samuel was already on the move. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The final confrontation was coming, and it was going to happen at Vargas's stronghold, the saloon that had become the cartel's command center. Samuel's plan was simple: get in, rescue Diego, and bring Vargas to justice. There was no room for hesitation or second chances. He knew the stakes, and he was prepared to pay whatever price was required. He arrived just as the town was waking up, the streets eerily quiet. There was a sense of finality in the air, a feeling that the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Samuel's horse clopped steadily down the dirt road, carrying him toward the saloon. The building loomed in front of him like a fortress, its windows dark and ominous. As he approached the entrance, a handful of cartel enforcers stepped into the street. Their eyes locked onto Samuel, and for a moment neither side moved. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for someone to make the first move. Samuel didn't flinch. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, and his face remained calm, the look of a man who had faced death more times than he cared to count. One of the enforcers, a hulking man with a scarred face, stepped forward. "You've come for the boy, haven't you?" he sneered. "You're wasting your time. Vargas isn't going to let you walk out of here." Samuel didn't respond. He simply drew his revolver, the motion smooth and fluid. Before the enforcer could even react, Samuel's bullet struck the man's weapon, sending it flying from his hand. The enforcer's eyes widened in shock as he staggered back, his feet tripping over one another. In that moment, the rest of the cartel men reacted. Guns were drawn, but Samuel was faster. His revolver fired with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. The sound of gunfire echoed through the quiet street, the chaos ringing in the air. The enforcers fell one by one, their weapons useless against Samuel's speed and accuracy. He moved like a force of nature, his every action deliberate, his every shot calculated. There was no hesitation, no mercy. They had come to take his town, his home, and Samuel wasn't going to let them do it without a fight. As the last of the enforcers dropped to the ground, Samuel stepped over their bodies, his eyes fixed on the saloon doors. He didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. He had one goal: get inside, rescue Diego, and face Vargas. The saloon doors swung open with a creak, revealing the dimly lit interior. The place reeked of smoke, whiskey, and sweat. The cartel's presence was suffocating, like a noose tightening around the town's neck. Vargas stood at the far end of the room, his back turned, talking with a few of his men. His face was hard, calculating, but when he heard the sound of footsteps, he turned. His eyes met Samuel's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "You!" Vargas spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should have known it would be you. You always were a thorn in my side." Samuel didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on Vargas, his expression unreadable. The silence between them was palpable, thick with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Vargas's hand slowly drifted to the gun at his side, but before he could draw, Samuel was already moving. The revolver fired again, the shot ringing out with deadly accuracy. Vargas's gun dropped to the ground with a dull thud. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Let the boy go, Vargas. This ends now." For a moment, Vargas just stood there, his face twisted in fury. But then, with a sneer, he motioned to one of his men. "Kill him," he ordered, his voice low and venomous. The command was the signal Samuel had been waiting for. He spun on his heel, his revolver flashing once more. His shots were lightning fast, knocking out the cartel's reinforcements with terrifying precision. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of gunfire and shouting filling the air. Samuel moved through the carnage like a storm, his every move calculated, his focus unbroken. He was a man who had lived through death and destruction before, and now he was the one bringing it to the very men who had thought they could control this town. The last of Vargas's men fell, their bodies scattered across the floor. Samuel's eyes never left Vargas, who stood near the back of the saloon, his hand now gripping a knife. "You think you've won?" Vargas spat, his voice seething with rage. "You're just an old man playing at being a hero. You can't stop me, no one can." But Samuel's gaze was unwavering. He took a step forward, his revolver aimed straight at Vargas's chest. "I'm not here to play games, Vargas. I'm here to end this." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath steady, his resolve unshakable. This was it, the final showdown, the battle for the town's future. And Samuel was prepared to do whatever it took to win. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Vargas stood, clutching the knife in his hand, his face contorted with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of both men waiting for the inevitable. The tension stretched thin, as if the very air was anticipating the final shot. But Samuel didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. His eyes never wavered from Vargas, but there was something else behind them now. Something more than just the cold, calculating stare of a man about to take another's life. There was a flicker of doubt, not in his own ability, but in the true cost of what he was about to do. Vargas smirked, clearly seeing the hesitation. "You're not the man they say you are. You're weak. You're just another old fool playing at being a hero. You won't pull that trigger, I know it." Samuel's grip tightened on his revolver, but he didn't fire. The weight of the moment hung over him like a storm cloud, dark and ominous. In that moment, Samuel realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just about him or Vargas or even the cartel. This was about the kind of man he had become, and he wasn't the killer he used to be. Suddenly, a soft voice cut through the tension. "Samuel." It was Diego, weak and ragged, emerging from the shadows behind Vargas. The boy's hands were bound, his face bruised, but his eyes, those eyes were filled with gratitude and hope. The sight of him broke through the fog in Samuel's mind like a bolt of lightning. It was for this moment, for this kid, that he had been fighting all along. Vargas turned to look, his momentary surprise quickly shifting to anger. He snarled and raised his knife in a sudden movement. "You think you can save him now, old man? You think your gun will make a difference?" But before Vargas could strike, there was a sudden shift in the room. The door to the saloon slammed open, and a few of the remaining townsfolk, those who had been too scared to act before, rushed in. They had seen enough, heard enough, and they could no longer stand by and do nothing. With them, they brought guns, axes, and even a few old rifles. "Get down!" shouted Tomas, Samuel's old friend, his voice carrying the weight of command. The men from the town took their positions, surrounding Vargas and his remaining men. Vargas's face twisted in fury, but for the first time the cartel's hold on the town seemed to loosen. The scales had tipped, and now Samuel had the upper hand. Vargas's grip on the knife faltered. He saw the shift in the crowd, the fear in his own men's eyes. They had underestimated Samuel. They had underestimated the power of a man who had once been a marshal, but now was fighting not just for his land, but for the very soul of the town. In that moment, Vargas's bravado crumbled. He lunged at Samuel, trying to catch him off guard with a wild slash of the knife, but Samuel was quicker. With a single, calculated move, he spun to the side, evading the attack, and brought his revolver up. The shot rang out. Vargas's knife dropped to the floor with a clatter, and the man himself stumbled back, clutching his side where the bullet had struck. His face twisted in pain, and for the first time the arrogance melted away. You can't kill me," Vargas gasped, blood staining his shirt. "You don't have it in you. You don't have the heart." Samuel's voice was low and firm, filled with the weight of everything he had lived through and everything he had learned. "I don't need to kill you, Vargas. You've already done enough damage." With that, Samuel lowered his revolver, the immediate threat neutralized. But the damage wasn't over. The remaining cartel men, now disarmed and defeated, began to retreat. The tide had turned. The town was no longer under the thumb of the cartel. As the remaining enforcers fled, the townsfolk gathered around Samuel, their faces a mixture of relief and admiration. But Samuel knew this wasn't a victory just for him. It was a victory for the town, for Diego, and for everyone who had risked everything to stand up against the cartel. He turned to Diego, his expression softening. "You're safe now, kid," Samuel said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Diego nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I thought you were never going to come for me, but you did. You saved us all." Samuel nodded, his hand gently cutting the ropes that bound Diego. "Sometimes doing what's right means walking away from everything you know, but you were never alone in this." As the townsfolk helped bind the wounded and take care of the remaining cartel men, Samuel stood there, watching the sun finally begin to rise over the town. The battle was over. The town was free. But as he looked out over the land, Samuel realized something. This wasn't just about the gunfights, the bloodshed, or the triumph of one man over a cartel. It was about justice, about standing up for what was right, even when the world tried to tell you it was impossible. And though peace had returned to the town for now, Samuel knew that the road ahead would never be simple. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his old gunslinger's heart shift. Maybe he didn't have to always be the one to pull the trigger. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready for a different kind of hero. Wounded but victorious, Samuel walked back toward the ranch, his home, his sanctuary. The battle was over, but the war within him would continue. He had found his peace, but peace, as he knew, could be a fleeting thing. And for now that was enough. The town, now free from the cartel's grip, began to heal. Samuel returned to his ranch, burying his revolver beneath the old oak tree. Though peace was fleeting, he had fought for it, and for the first time he felt a sense of quiet resolve. Just as he thought it was over, a mysterious rider approached, signaling that his journey was far from finished. The legend of the Silent One lived on.